Yeah, people are coming in. I'm glad we waited just a few minutes. So, hey, everybody. Let's see. Oh, I see that somebody answered the chat there that there have been a few sightings of gray whales. I know. Oh, in San Francisco Bay, right in the bay. That's kind of cool. That's kind of interesting. That seems to be something kind of new. I mean, there's been a few in the past, but that they're cruising into the bay is kind of unusual. Great. All right, well, welcome everyone. Welcome to our version of Whale Festival. It's an ongoing, long, historical event that the Mendocino Coast and beyond gets really excited to kind of welcome that migration northward of our Pacific gray whale as it makes its way from the Baja Lagoons up to Alaska, up to where our speaker is from, up to see Janet. So this is kind of a kickoff of the celebration of the Whale Festival 2021. Lots of virtual events, and yeah, we will definitely be celebrating the whales. The whales have no idea that we are needing to be socially distanced and masked up. They're cruising by. So the Noyo Center is really excited to welcome Janet Clarke here. She was a student of Humboldt State many years ago and just told me that she got her diving certification here at Van Dam, which is just down the road from me. So we love it when the students come down and fill the parking lot and get their funny looking flippers on and go into the water in the Van Dam Bay. So that's kind of a nice connection. And yeah, Janet Clarke has now been, she told me it was a while ago that she was at Humboldt State. And since then, she's been finding her happy place up north in the Alaskan Arctic and getting to know some of the animals that I have never met. So this is a Noyo Center event, and we do ask if you have it in you that we would love your support to support us in these ongoing presentations that we're bringing to you. You can go to our website, and it's a $10 suggested donation to keep us chugging along during these times. And yeah, I think that with that said, I'm happy to introduce you to Janet Clarke. Thank you, Janet.
All right, thank you, Sarah, and thank you for inviting me to talk about a subject that's really near and dear to me. I am going to be kind of switching my cameras on my laptop, which is here, but I'm seeing my presentation over here, so I'll be kind of switching here. When I was putting together this presentation, the first thing I thought of was what really describes the Alaskan Arctic, having to do, with whales. And two things immediately came to mind, and that is that they eat a lot, I mean, constantly. And we see a lot of calves. And so that's kind of why I titled this what I did. I've been working up there for a long time. I actually live in Washington State up in the Cascade foothills, but I've been going up to Alaska ever since 1982. This was actually the first job I had when I got out of college. It was a temporary job, and I'm still working at it, so that's kind of fun. I am going to, let's see, how do I get this to go? There we go. I'm going to give you a little bit of a kind of just ground us geographically in terms of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to be talking about the Pacific Arctic. And of course, the Arctic is the northern polar region. The Antarctic is the southern polar region. There are, by the way, no penguins in the northern polar region. So whenever you see that polar bear and penguin together, know that that does not happen in reality, unless at a zoo. So the Arctic, of course, when I talk about the Arctic, I always tend to think just about the marine environment, and it's not just the marine environment. The Pacific Arctic, which is what I'm showing here, is Russia, Alaska, and Canada. We share the Pacific Arctic. Usually we share it pretty well. And it encompasses the Eastern Siberian Sea, Chukchi Sea, Beaufort Sea, and the Bering Sea is actually considered part of the Arctic. The Alaskan Arctic is this kind of red area here, and pretty much the Alaska-Canada border over to the international date line, which is right here. And then it makes a weird kind of a squiggle. That's probably not accurate, but it does make a weird jog like that, and includes the Bering Sea. The Arctic is a really, really rich area, culturally, biologically, natural resources. It's just got it all, and I truly do love it. There are several indigenous groups in Alaska and Canada and Russia, of course, and I'll be mentioning some of them. So the Inupiat live along the northern coast here, pretty much down to about this area. Alaskan Yupik are in this area, Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. You have Siberian Yupik, so they have actually closer cultural and kinship ties with Siberia. They're on St. Lawrence Island. And you have the Alutiiq, which are on the Peninsula and the Aleutian Island chain. And in the interior, you have Athabascan speakers. And so again, they've been there for thousands of years, very, very rich cultural area. So most of the photographs I'm going to show and the information I'm going to talk about comes from this area in the green hatching. And this was a study area that I'm very familiar with, especially this area in the Western Beaufort and the Northeastern Chukchi Sea. And we were fortunate enough to do a little bit of surveys over here in Canada one year as well. So when we start talking about whales in the Pacific Arctic, we can kind of separate them into kind of three groups. You have the truly Arctic, and those are bowhead whales. Of course, right here, you have a cow-calf pair. Belugas, this is a fairly rare sighting of a single beluga. They're usually in larger groups. And narwhals, and this is, of course, a very nice artist rendition of a smiling narwhal. That's how they look in real life, too. Not really, but, you know. There's a reason why I put a drawing there instead of a photo. Then we have what we call seasonal regulars, and these should be pretty familiar to you because these are indeed gray whales, the same gray whales that migrate along the coast of California. And the ones that are there in yellow are what we call kind of the big three for the Alaskan Arctic, because those are the three that we see the most of by far, are bowheads, belugas, and gray whales. Then we also have what we call subarctics, and these are kind of new to the Alaskan Arctic, but kind of, not entirely. And I'll talk a little bit about that when I get to them. They include humpbacks, fins, minkies, and killer whales, and also harbor porpoise. I'll be talking about the first four. Harbor porpoise, I don't have a lot of information on them. They're up there, they're fairly common, but you don't see them a lot. And I don't have any good photos of them because they're also like this big when you see them from the plane. So, they're not my photos. These are photos from my team. I am a horrible photographer. So these are people that have been were on our team for so many years, excellent photographers. But you'll notice that they are pretty much all, with the exception of the narwhal, overhead shots. They're bird's eye view. And that's because these photos have nearly all of them come out of the same project, which was an aerial survey project. And it was called Aerial Surveys of Arctic Marine Mammals, or ASAM. This project went on, it started in 1979, and it went through 2020. The last year for the field season was 2019, that's an incredible amount of time to be able to essentially keep doing the same project. I was lucky enough to be on the project from 1982 to 1992, and then again from 2007 through 2020. And during the latter time period, I was actually the co-manager of the project. We conducted aerial surveys every July through October in twin-engine aircraft. So this is an Aero Commander, which is the aircraft we actually use the most. We also use Twin Otters. And we flew with a team of 5. You'd have a co-pilot. We'd have 2 dedicated observers on either side of the plane. They would sit at bubble windows so they could look straight under the plane as well as out. And then we had a data recorder and who input all of the information into a laptop. And again, being up there from July through October, we saw pretty much every temperature extreme there is. I was in Utqiagvik when it was 72 degrees, and I've also been up there when it was below 0. So you get to see kind of a little bit of everything over this type of a project in that time span. I'm going to talk about bowhead whales first. And the reason I'm going to do that is because they are my favorites and always have been ever since I started doing this work. But the other reason I'm going to talk about bowheads first is that is the species that really is in many respects responsible for so much of the research that's gone on in the Alaskan Arctic. Bowheads, there are many things about them that are cool, as I'll get into, but there are three sort of variables that are somewhat unique to bowhead whales. The first one, not entirely unique, they're endangered species, so of course they have extra protection under the Endangered Species Act. They are also hunted by Native Alaskans. There's a subsistence hunt from about 11 villages, and that's fairly unique. And part of their migration goes right through areas that are, from time to time, very high interest to oil and gas industry. So when you put those three components together, you have this rather unique situation, and that really, bowhead is why there's been so much research done up there. So bowheads start out winter down here in the Bering Sea. They actually are mostly on the Russian side. In the springtime, the majority of them will migrate up here over to the Canadian Beaufort. There are 500 to 1,000 perhaps that might stay over here on the Chukotka side, but most of the population migrates up. The migration along this coastline is very close to shore, and that is where the majority of the subsistence hunt takes place, are in villages. St. Lawrence Island actually hunts as well. Point Hope, there are several villages along here. Utqiagvik is one of the largest ones. And then the spring migration offshore in the Beaufort Sea is offshore in the Beaufort Sea in spring. In summer, their distribution, it was once thought their distribution was pretty much just here. We now know, actually through some of our research and through satellite tags, their distribution is quite extensive. They can be up here in Viscount Melville Sound, along Banks Island, and they can even range all the way over here to the Chukchi Sea. And then in the fall, they migrate back, and this is where bowheads will encounter most of it, will be the offshore oil and gas industry. Exploration, there's been some drilling, and again, that's why a lot of research has been done. And then they can come up here fairly far to the north. Most of them actually do something like this, kind of hit the Chukotka coast and then migrate down here and end up back in the Bering Sea in winter. The research that this is a composite basically that shows all of our sightings, 1982 through 2019. And the thing I want to point out is that bowheads are kind of a shallow water whale. They're going to be mostly on the shelf. They're a little farther offshore in the summer, but mostly on the shelf. In September and October, you rarely find them in water more than 50 meters deep. And when they come over here in the Chukchi, they kind of spread out quite a bit. You can see that even from our data, even though our survey area didn't go that far north. This was a little bit of data that we collected 1 year over in Canada. So just a little bit of information from there. Okay, bowhead whales. This is why I love them. I mean, they're beautiful. They're big, black, blubbery. I mean, they got it all. Their closest relative is the right whale, North Atlantic and North Pacific right whales. But they do differ from them in a few respects. For one thing, they do not have the callosities on the bonnet. They actually are more robust than right whales. And that's, of course, because they spend their entire year in the Arctic. They are truly an Arctic species. They're, for the most part, black, and they will have white on the chin. So on most of these whales, you can see white on the chin. That white on the chin will remain pretty much the same from birth. I mean, it'll get comparatively bigger as the whale gets bigger, but it doesn't increase in size over time. However, the white on the tail does. So you see these whales up here, I can tell right now that these are fairly young whales because they have very little white on the tail. This whale, however, could be as much as 100 years old. This whale here, which has almost an entirely white tail, could be close to 200 years old because bowheads are known to live more than 200 years, which I think is amazing. That is I think that is the longest lived mammal. And they know that from several different lines of evidence. They're also, this little white dot right there, that's actually the eye, and the white on the eye will increase over time as well. They are a good sized bowhead whale, 55 to 60 feet, and upwards of 100 tons, or perhaps even more. So they're pretty impressive, pretty impressive specimen. They are truly Arctic dweller, as I mentioned. There are 4 different populations. This is the Western Arctic population. Numbers about 17,000, give or take. The population is considered pretty holding steady, possibly even increasing. This particular population was hunted by commercial whalers from about 1850 to 1910. It was estimated the population probably decreased from around 27,000 to as few as 3,000. But again, it has rebounded. I mentioned that it is hunted for subsistence. There are about 11 villages that hunt bowheads. It's a very sustainable hunt. It's managed by the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission. They have very, very careful rules about when hunts occur, who can hunt, and so forth. I've been in the villages, a couple of them, when whales have been pulled in the fall, and I really cannot overstate how important bowhead whale hunting is to these villages. It's important nutritionally, culturally, spiritually. So it's this animal is revered, really, among the Inupiat and Siberian Yupik. So first going to talk about feeding, bowhead whale feeding. So bowhead whales are a baleen whale, no teeth. They feed on very small organisms. This thing up in the corner, Calanus hyperboreus, looks rather large and inviting to eat right there, but notice that it is really only about a 1/4 inch. So these are very tiny things of food. So of course they have to eat a lot of them. Bowheads have a very long baleen. It's the longest baleen of any of the whales. It's about 13 feet. And the hairs on it are extremely fine. I have a piece of baleen, which if we have time, I'll show that. The hairs are extremely fine because, again, they need to be basically capturing these very small animals in the baleen. They capture it in the baleen. It's rather passive. Then when there are enough stuck in the baleen, the whale will essentially close their mouth, swallow, and the water will exit out through the back of the mouth. So to give you an idea of what you're looking at in this photo, this is 2 whales. And they are snout, they're on their sides. And this might help a little bit to give you an idea for what we're looking at. So here are the upper jaws. Here are the baleen plates. And bowheads have about 350 baleen plates per side of the mouth. So that's upwards of 700 complete in their mouth. So there are a lot of baleen plates here. And baleen and blubber were the 2 things that commercial whalers were after. Upper jaws, here are the lower jaws. Remember, they have the white chin patches. Here is one of the flippers, pectoral flipper off of this whale. And back here, these are actually the flukes. Bowheads, belugas, and gray whales, none of them have dorsal fins. So if we see a whale has a dorsal fin, we know it's not one of those 3. And if we saw a dorsal fin that high, we'd be looking at a killer whale, I'm pretty sure. So this is a very common thing that we would see in terms of feeding. They're basically skim feeding on the surface. Wherever whales are feeding, you're going to have birds, and in the marine mammal world, we call these white birds. I would go so far as to say they're gulls. I'm not going to go any farther to say what species they are. Here's another shot of some bowheads feeding, and again, we have white birds. So there are 5 whales here, very closely aligned. So in kind of in different attitudes in the water, I guess. So we've got 2 here. Here is the lower jaw. There's the baleen plates. So they have the same configuration. Here's a 3rd whale. Notice, however, that here's the lower jaw. This is the upper jaw, baleen plates. Here's your 4th whale, kind of on its side, but not as much, because you can see the upper jaw, but you can't really see the lower jaw. And then whale number 5 is actually got his dorsal side up. So he's right side up, so to speak. And you can tell because here's his, you can see the upper jaw, and if you look down here, you can see the shadow of flukes. So bowheads, like other mysticete baleen whales, they don't form big aggregations. When they're transiting somewhere, you might see 1 to 3, in a group, a loosely configured group. But when there's good feeding, you can see, we've seen 500 in one immediate area. They will take advantage of the really good food wherever they are. We've seen feeding all across the Alaskan Beaufort Sea. The prime feeding spots are in Canada and just to the east of Point Barrow, but they will feed just about everywhere. Anywhere they can find food, they will feed. So here's a group of 9, possibly 10 whales at the surface. You've got some skim feeders here. They're on their sides. These two, we can see just the upper jaw, but not the lower jaw. So we know that the upper jaw is right there at the surface. The lower jaw is down. We know they're feeding. These two just hanging out, not sure what they're doing, but there's at least 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and there could be more on the surface. Again, this is very typical of what we'd see for feeders. And these birds over here, I actually do know what they are, at least 1 of 2. They're either guillemots or mures. Both are found in the area and would be found very near bowheads feeding. So calves, of course, is the other thing that we see. Now, bowhead calves are born in spring, most of them, April and May. They could be born as early as March, and there have been newborns seen in August, but mostly they're in spring, which means that the calves that we see are, you know, in the 2 to 7 month old range. So we're not going to see the little peanuts that we see in spring, but there can be quite a range in calves. For example, if you look at the one down here in the lower left, that's a fairly small calf, and compare it with this size up here is a much larger calf. Calves are adorable. I don't know, babies of anything are just adorable, and bowheads are no different. One thing I wanted to point out is this female right here. Look at that white tail. This is a female that's probably, based on the white on that tail, 150 years old. To the best of our knowledge at this time, it appears that bowheads remain reproductively active even, into their late hundreds. How would you like to say that? I'm in my late hundreds and still having babies. And one of the reasons I want to point out that we know that kind of information is because there is a subsistence hunt for these whales. We've been able to get an extraordinary amount of information about the biology of these animals. And that's been through this very, very good partnership between scientists and hunters at several different villages, primarily in Utqiagvik. And we have this wonderful database that has actually led to a book like this one. It's a bowhead whale, which has all kinds of very cool resources in it. I've got it bookmarked like 17 Ways to Sunday there. So calves, they have one calf, not twins. We occasionally will see calves at the surface alone, which used to be a concern. But when you realize that the cows could dive for 16 to 20 minutes as they go to the bottom to feed, calves don't have the capability to dive like that, nor do they need to. They're not feeding, they're nursing from their mom. So the calves will oftentimes be hovering at the surface. Sometimes we actually will see one cow with 2 calves. There's no evidence of twinning in bowheads. That would be way too much of an investment of energy for a female. So this is probably, here's one calf and here's another one. This is probably just an extra calf whose mom is down feeding. This whale up here is actually called an ingatuk. It's not a calf. This is a whale that's about 1 to 5 years old. And what happens with whales after they're weaned is that they will grow in girth, but not in length. They really won't grow in length for about 5 years. And for that first 5 years, they're just putting on the girth. I'm not embarrassed to say that we call them fatties. That's a good thing for a bowhead, because the more girth you have, the more protected, the more blubber you have, and the more your environment. The other thing about ingatuks is that their heads are smaller than they are in relation to the body than they are at adults. An adult bowhead whale head can be over 1/3 of the size of the body. It's massive. And so when you see that massive head open and eating, you can imagine how much food it can take in. They're very, very large heads. So other behaviors with bowheads that we see breaching on occasion. It's not real common, but we do see it. And I love this photo over here of the breacher. This is actually a calf. And so you can see it's got a tiny little chin patch. Again, that chin patch won't get any bigger on that whale as it grows. You can actually see the flipper. You can see this is a really good look at this very arched jaw. And if you look really carefully right there, that's the eyeball. So it's really, and it's very smooth skinned. I mean, that's a baby. That's your baby. It's very smooth skin. We would see flipper slapping. Really good look at the paddle shaped flippers. We see tail flapping. And we see this behavior, which we came up with a really scientifically correct term for it. It's called log play. That's right, log play. We really went out on a limb. All ages, they will swim under them, they'll swim over them, and we've seen them toss them up in the air. And so the significance of it, don't really know. So that's why we just simply called it log play. Okay, on to gray whales. So again, these are the same gray whales that are passing Fort Bragg. The majority of them, will make somewhat of an entire migration. We know that a lot of gray whales don't make the entire migration, but many of them head down here to Mexico for the winter, calving down there, mating, making that return migration. We know there are places where they stop along the way. We have gray whales called the Sounders, which is also the name of the Seattle soccer team. A little confusing. The Sounders will actually stay in the Puget Sound area. They don't migrate out. And in fact, many of the same whales are seen every year here. But a great majority of them will migrate up here to the Pacific Arctic. Probably many more gray whales are actually on the Russian side. We don't have a good feel for that because there's not as much research that goes on over there. But just anecdotal information and a few research cruises that have gone over there, there's a lot of gray whales on the Russian side. But of course, we look at them over here. And here's basically what we see, the distribution that we've seen. So again, this is the date line, international date line. So we can't fly on the other side. Well, we can, but it's frowned on and we don't really want to go there. When we fly in this area, we can look across that date line and see gray whales everywhere. So we know they're over there. This is one area of concentration. It's a really rich, it's called Hope Basin, extremely rich feeding area. This area up here used to be really, really good feeding area. Around 2015, gray whales kind of abandoned it. It's not, we still see them sort of, but not near as much. And this has become the big area. They're very seldom seen in the Beaufort Sea. So this is data from 1982 to 2019. This is years of data. And you can see there's very few sightings of gray whales in the Beaufort Sea. But I do want to point out these little puppies over here. My team saw these in August of 2019. They were doing surveys for bowheads, and they came upon 15 gray whales. And this represents the most gray whales ever seen in the Canadian Beaufort in one day, the most bowheads ever seen in the Canadian Beaufort in 1 year, actually. So they will head out into areas where we wouldn't expect to see them. Gray whales, it's really hard to find a photo of a gray whale where it's not feeding from the Arctic. They feed constantly everywhere as much as they can. But I did find a few in our files. The really triangular head. You really can't mistake a gray whale for anything else. There are two stocks of gray whales, as I'm sure many of you know. There's Eastern North Pacific and the Western North Pacific. We are pretty sure these are mostly Eastern North Pacific. There was a tagged Western North Pacific gray whale that did head up into the Bering Sea. It didn't make the full migration, as anybody knows. So we kind of assume these are Eastern North Pacific. There's a new population estimate right now, which is around 20,000, which is down from 2016, I think, which was around 27,000. Again, feeding is really what they do in the Arctic. They will feed along the migration route, but really they're heading to the Arctic to chow down. This group here that's a really kind of, I'd say, almost rare sighting. Gray whales, again, a baleen whale, they're not going to hang out in big gregarious groups unless they're feeding. And then we think it's really more, they happen to be in a good feeding area together. But this is a traveling group. And the reason I know it's traveling is you can see, actually you can't see, you really don't see any of their pectoral flippers. The flippers are tucked in right next to the body. And so that indicates that these guys were on the move. You can see with this one and these guys down here, you can see their pectoral flippers. They're swimming much, much more slowly. So on to gray whale feeding. First of all, while I'm talking, look at the photo and find the gray whales, and we'll see if you found all the gray whales in this photo. This is a very typical scene that we would see up there of gray whales feeding. Gray whales, as I'm sure many of you know, they go down to the bottom. They use suction to bring food like this, like this one, out of the bottom. And then all of that sediment that they've also picked up, that gets strained out through the back of their mouth, and the food gets caught in the baleen. Gray whale baleen is much coarser than bowhead whale baleen. And so when you look at the size of this Ampellisca macrocephala, it's about 1.5 inches, which, still not real big, but when you compare it to what bowheads are feeding on, this is a giant. So they eat kind of larger prey than bowheads do. They really do feed in on near the bottom, but they will also water column feed. We know that from foods that have been found in the areas where they've been. And what ends up happening is we get these mud plumes. So mud plumes, these are all mud plumes. They've started to disperse because of the wind and the currents, but you have some really new mud plumes right here and right here and right here. And those are what the gray whales are bringing up from the bottom. So in answer to the question for how many gray whales are in this photo, there are 5. So some of them are kind of easy to find because they were with these fresh mud plumes. But then we have this one that really didn't have a mud plume, and we have this one that doesn't have a mud plume. So again, this is a very typical view that we would have as we're flying along and we come upon a feeding aggregation of gray whales. When we collect our data, we only collect data for whales that we see. So we wouldn't go along here and go, well, I think there's probably 40. I think there might be that many. We only, actually record the ones that we see. So this would have probably been a sighting of 5. Here's another view of beautiful water. This was actually over in Canada. And as our team was surveying, they came on these mud plumes and were like, this looks like gray whales. But nobody really believed it until they saw the gray whale. And then they saw 14 more in a couple of groups. So again, these are all mud plumes of kind of different ages, more dispersed, some of them more dispersed, some of them tighter. I think that if this photo was 2 seconds later, there probably would be a gray whale popping up right here because that's a fairly new mud plume right there. So again, mud plumes are just a really good sighting cue for gray whales. I really like this photo because it shows kind of the whole sequence. You've got the older plume back here. You've got more recent plume that's been coming out of its mouth, and you can look and you can actually see there's still mud coming out of the mouth on that gray whale. So that's a real good photo of a gray whale producing that mud plume from the bottom. Here's a cow and calf. So the cow has actually surfaced probably around here and then circled around, probably heading back towards the calf, still mud plume. The calf, notice, doesn't have a mud plume. Calf has not gone to the bottom. This calf has probably not been weaned yet. If it had been weaned, it probably wouldn't be with its mom. So it's not going to the bottom. It's not suction feeding yet. It's just kind of heading back over to mom. And then here's another cow-calf pair. Again, you've got your mud plume here. Here's your cow, really beautiful conditions on this day. We don't oftentimes get those conditions. Nice triangular snout. You can see that little bit of an arch there. Here's the mud plume. And then also, I just have to point out, here's some kind of darker brown material. That's not mud plume. If you follow the darker brown to its source, yeah, what goes in has to come out. So we in the science community call that poop, unless somebody gets really excited and they go, oh my God, defecation. And no matter how you slice it, it's the same thing. Okay, so calves. So gray whale calves, of course, gray whales calve down in Baja in the winter. So calves that we see, gray whale calves that we see, are probably 7 to even 9 months old. So they're very close to being weaned. And they're big. I mean, these are not your cute little gray whale calves that might come up to the boat in Baja, want their chin scratched. These are close to weaning. And so they're really good sized. Gray whales, again, they're not gregarious animals. They're not going to form big social groups. So if we find a large animal that's in really close association with a noticeably smaller animal, we can assume that's her calf. That's the calf of the year. They're pretty good sized. And again, we're right on the cusp of them probably being weaned. Occasionally we get a couple of cow-calf pairs that are really close together. So that's what we have here. Here's the adult. We've got a couple of calves here, and here's the other cow right under here. We do calf counts, of course. We keep track of everything we see. And we don't see as many as are seen on calf counts along the California coast. So what I plotted here is calf counts from two different groups in California, American Cetacean Society in LA, and then Southwest Fisheries Science Center that does the calf counts off of Granite Canyon. And they see more calves, obviously, than we do. But what's interesting is that all of our calf counts kind of mirror each other. So we all kind of show they were very low in 2009 and 2010. And then we started to see this big increase, a little downswell here in 2013, started to increase again. And 2016 was really either 2014 or 2016 was when we had the most calves. And then they started going down again. So calf numbers will go up and down over the course of the years. Of course, there's something else going on right now, which many of you I'm sure are aware of, and I'll talk about in a minute, but have this fluctuation in calf numbers is fairly common with gray whales. So a little bit of fun stuff with gray whales. We do see them breaching. It's not real common. Gray whales are not big breachers, at least up in the Pacific Arctic. But here's definitely a gray whale. You can see those double throat grooves and the very narrow triangular throat head. You can't really mistake them. I was on the plane one time that the airport in Utqiagvik is right on the water. So final approach, you're going right over gray whales that are just right out there feeding or transiting. So we were on final approach and we saw this gray whale, and we probably saw it breach just in the time we were passing it 4 or even 5 times. I mean, it would breach, go under, come up, breach, go under. It just kept doing that. Would I get off the plane, and I always go for a walk. You know, I've been on the plane for 5 hours. I need some air, a little bit of exercise. Probably about an hour after we landed on my walk, I was coming back along the coast, and I look out there, as I always do, and there's a breaching gray whale. And I would put money on the fact it was the same gray whale still breaching, because as I watched it, it just breached. It was a very, very rapid sequence of breaching. We know that the one that we saw on approach was the same whale. I have no reason to believe the other one wasn't the same whale either. So it's rare, but apparently when it's done a lot. Gray whales will hang out in close association with other whales, with other species. Humpbacks and fin whales, particularly in the southern Chukchi Sea. And occasionally they'll hang out with other whales as well. So our team was looking at bowheads, a feeding aggregation of bowhead whales. And lots of bowheads, so they're really focusing on how many bowheads and trying to get an accurate count. And it wasn't until they got back to camp that they actually looked at the photos and realized that was a gray whale. Wasn't even in the data until that point. So this was just around the corner of Point Barrow. And again, you know, there's a little bowhead a little gray whale lurking with the bowheads. And this one in the corner is kind of a fun thing too. That's not a beluga. That is a white gray whale, or anomalously colored, as we say. We don't know if it was an albino. It was just mostly white. One of my colleagues, Amy Willoughby, we saw this in 2013, saw it twice actually, in 2 different locations. She took it upon herself. She looked at the photos, and then she searched to see if there was any other records of white belugas or white gray whales. And she found 2 other records of the same whale, was able to match it from the coloration. When we saw it in 2013, it had a normally pigmented calf. It was documented in Baja in 2012, and it was documented in Baja again in 2016, and it had another calf, again, normally pigmented. So that was kind of a fun thing. There's also some not so fun things having to do with gray whales, especially right now. There is what's called a UME, or an unusual mortality event, that's going on, started in 2019, continued in 2020. I think it's a little bit too early to tell if it's still going on in 2021. There's some data coming in, but COVID has put a lot of restrictions on who can go out and do different things. UME is when more than usual carcasses roll onto shore. And we saw several up in the Alaskan Arctic, and of course they were elsewhere in Alaska, in Baja, along the West Coast, Canada, and we even have some reports that have come in from Russia, not too many, but a few. Causes for the UME likely have to do with resources, perhaps food availability or food, how good the food is. We know that in 2019, when we were still surveying, that gray whales were feeding like crazy. What we don't know is how good the food was. Did it have the same nutrient content? Was it as good as it used to be? We don't know. There are a lot of possibilities, and NOAA is coordinating research and trying to figure out what some of these possibilities might be. This is not the first UME that's been documented. There was a UME, I think it was 1999 and 2000. There was another gray whale UME. The population dipped, but it was back up to 27,000 in 2016. So gray whales are pretty resilient. I think they'll probably come through this okay. On the other hand, it's a very changing world, so something to keep an eye on. Belugas, in the Pacific Arctic, there are several stocks. The two that we would see would be this one here, which is Eastern Chukchi Sea. This is the Beaufort Sea stock. These are areas where they calve and molt. And this is where you would see large congregations of belugas. Otherwise, we usually see smaller groups. This is our data. And one thing I want to point out is if you recall bowheads were pretty much in this area near shore. They're going to be found on the shelf. Belugas are really found on the slope. And that's, it's almost black, even though the icon is yellow, but there's so many beluga sightings starting on the slope. They feed on Arctic cod, and cod are usually found at around the 200, even the 300 meter depth area. And so they would be going out on the slope, and even farther. You can see how far they range out here, this light blue, to feed. So this is basically part of a large group of belugas that was seen on near Kasigaluk Lagoon, which is one of the molting and calving areas. To be perfectly honest, belugas, when they're in a group like this, to the naked eye, they kind of look like maggots. I mean, that's what they look like. I have seen, not recently, but in the earlier times, I've seen groups more than 1,000 belugas in this one small area. Wow. Most of the time, though, they're going to be in groups more like this. Maybe 10 to 15. We sometimes see just cow-calf pairs. You very rarely see a beluga all by itself. That's pretty rare to see that. Belugas are kind of cool. Belugas and narwhals are kind of cool because they are the only whales that do not have completely fused vertebrae. So they can actually move their heads. And you can kind of see that in some of these photos, like this one right here and that one. They can actually move their heads from side to side. They can also move their heads up and down. And narwhals are the same way. So belugas they're pretty fun. And of course, if you ever hear an acoustic recording of a beluga, it's actually beautiful. They're called the canaries of the sea. And it's a very, very pretty sound. Beluga calves are hard to see. And calves are usually born again in the spring. They are gray or brown when they're born. They actually will not turn. Belugas won't turn white until they're about 8 years old. So they are difficult to see. In this photo, there are 9 belugas and there are 2 calves. So one of the calves is fairly easy to see, and the other one is much harder to see because it's right on top of another one. So we know in our data, for example, that we underestimate beluga calves. We don't go and circle on belugas usually. We only circle on large whales, so we know we underestimate calves because they're just really difficult to see. All right, narwhals. I have only one photograph of a narwhal, and it wasn't taken by my team, and there's a reason for that. This is, of course, a polar view. So to orient you, here's Alaska. would be where our study area is. Notice where the purple is. It's nowhere near Alaska. There have been narwhals seen in Alaska, but they are very rare. In our 41-year database, we have one sighting of 2 belugas, and oddly enough, they were all the way down here near Nome. So they obviously got there from over here, but that was quite a trip. They are really actually even rare in this area of Canada. They're really found up here in Greenland and in the high Arctic of the Canadian archipelago. They are, again, they are in the same family as belugas, but they do look pretty different. Narwhals, of course, unicorn, are just a really interesting species in and of itself. They have just 2 teeth. Males and females will have only 2 teeth. In males, one of the tusks, sometimes 2, erupt actually from the front of the head, and that's what this is. It grows in kind of a spiral, and they can be upwards of 8 feet. 5 foot is more common, but they can be as much as 8 feet. Females also have the 2 teeth, but very rarely will they erupt outside of the head. They are suction feeders. You have 2 teeth, you're really not going to be capturing your prey with your teeth. So they are going to be sucking in the stuff that they eat, pretty much like beaked whales do, and other deep water. They're a deep water feeder. They do not use, the tusk is not used for feeding at all. And that really shouldn't come as a surprise, because imagine if you're this narwhal and you stabbed a fish with this tusk. Good for you, but how are you going to get in your mouth? So the tusk is really a display. It's like antlers in deer. So it's trying to impress the girls and trying to intimidate the boys is what the tusks are used for. This photo was by a colleague of mine, Kristen Ladra, and she does a lot of work up in Greenland on marine mammals up there, and she works off of the ice and shore and boats. So we've got a different view, not an overhead view of narwhals. We had a pretty much for my teams, there was a special prize that would be given if anybody ever saw a narwhal, and I believe I still have that special prize. I don't know where it is, but it was a special prize. So subarctics, what we call subarctics, these are, again, we're going to be talking about humpbacks, fins, and minkies, and killer whales. They're new to the area, but they kind of aren't. There are definitely a lot of whaler records that these species existed up in this area, especially in the southern Chukchi. They probably are pretty new in this area up here. We're not seeing a lot of them. These are humpbacks, and you can see most of them are down here in the south central Chukchi. We know that there are a lot of humpbacks on the Russian side as well. Their expansion or us seeing a lot more of them in this area is probably due to a number of things. One, changing climate change. There's a lot less ice, water's getting warmer, prey bases are likely changing. Number 2, they might be recovering from commercial whaling, because believe it or not, there was illegal whaling, mostly by the Russians, as recently as 1970 on these species. And probably the third reason that we're seeing them more is that there was a whole lot more survey effort starting in 2008. And so if you're looking for them, a lot of times you're going to find them. Humpbacks, really can't mistake in them. They've got the nice big old flippers. They got the knobs on the head. Here's one feeding. Again, we think that the main reason they come up is for food. So you've got a ton of throat grooves here, just a big old guppy looking thing. And I mentioned before that gray whales like to hang out with them. This is a humpback, and right next door are a couple of gray whales. What this means is that when you're surveying, especially in these areas down here, you pretty much have to investigate every sighting, because you can have grays and humpbacks and fin whales very closely with one another. And so you really do need to investigate all of the sightings. Fin whales, which are just beautiful, they are really, their distribution is much more southern Chukchi. We did see a few up here. These sightings are all from one year, 2019, which was a really crazy year, oceanographically and everything else. Again, feeding is probably the main reason they're up there. Big old guppy with its throat grooves extended, but they do bring their calves, believe it or not. That's a calf. Fin whales, of course, second largest of all the cetaceans, only the blue whales larger. I think we saw about 8 fin whale calves over the course out of around 250 fin whales. So not a lot, but they do bring them up there. And then Minke whales. And Minke whales are have the most dispersed distribution. And the other thing I'll say about Minke whales is we probably underreport those incredibly, because our nickname for Minke whales are slinky minkies. They are very hard to recite. So our standard way of surveying is you're flying a straight line on a transect. You get a sighting, you take down all your initial data, and then you divert over and circle to confirm the species, see if there's any calves, get final numbers. By the time you do that with a Minke whale, it's gone. It's down. You can circle on it, it won't come back up. So these are literally like the only 2 photos we have of Minke whales. This one was actually kind of pseudo breaching, not a big breach, but a little one. But you can see one of the characteristics of a Minke whale, which is that white on the flipper. We call those Minke mittens. And here you can see it on this Minke as well. They're also not very big. They're the smallest of the baleen whales. So they're just a smaller one, but we know we underreport them. We know that there's more Minke whales out there than we can see. They're just very stealthy. And then killer whales. It's my last slide. Everybody goes, yay. Killer whales are very dispersed for what we can see. There's evidence that they're showing up more. We think because there's less ice. And ice, at least in the northern polar regions, have been considered an impediment to killer whales. Not in the south, they're all over Antarctica. But in the north, they really have been. And definitely in the Canadian Beaufort, it's been shown, and we're beginning to see that in the Atlantic Arctic. We're beginning to see that in the Pacific as well. There's increased evidence of predation on both killer whales, on both gray whales and bowhead whales. Not just, we see it in rake marks, of course, on the animals, but we're seeing more carcasses that appear to have been predated upon. We generally see them in groups like this, anywhere from 3 to 15. We're not sure what stock they're from, but pretty sure they're mammal eaters. We have been able to photo identify one male that we saw right up here near Barrow, or Utqiagvik, right up here, with a male from Unimak Pass in the Aleutians, and he was a known gray whale chomper. So again, calves, we see calves showing up. Here's a calf, here's a calf. So I would anticipate there's going to be continued increased sightings of killer whales up in the Pacific Arctic. And I think, references. I always list my references, and plus it gave me an opportunity to put polar bear photos up, because polar bears are pretty cool too. The one I want to point out, though, if this first one up here, even though the project is no longer active, the National Marine Fisheries Service maintains a website that has a lot of stuff. First of all, we make all of our data publicly available. Our entire database is available to anybody who wants to use it, and we encourage people to use it. It's a phenomenal database. On the website, you can also find our annual reports, which, if you're having trouble sleeping, those are a good thing to download and perhaps read. Actually, I think they're fascinating, but I write them, so I think they're fascinating. But the other thing that I want to mention is that links off of that main page include blogs that our team members did when they were in the field for, I think, 2, maybe even 3 years. And so phenomenal photographs of mammals and muskox and walrus, and just scenic shots, and some experiences people had and things that they saw, and the blogs in and of themselves are really cool to read. I always enjoyed reading the blogs that our team did. And that, I believe, is the end of my talk. I do have extra slides, but we'll stop there.
That was phenomenal. What a fascinating window into some mysterious animals. I tend to be so centric. I know my animals that are close to where I live. So it's just fascinating. I know so little about those creatures that you just introduced to us from the Alaskan Arctic. And wow, thank you so much. That was really, really cool. I know I had one question, and I think we're going to get some questions in the chat. I hope that people will not be shy. This is a wonderful opportunity to learn and to have a conversation with Karen. So, don't be shy. I see that Sue's got her hand up. Sue Coulter, go right ahead. I think you have to unmute, or Trey will.
There we go. Thank you so much for this fantastic talk. It was just phenomenal. Loved everything about it. I just had a curiosity with the bowheads, with having such long baleen. does it just lay and go down their throat when they're not open? That's always been a mystery to me.
Yeah, it's really pretty amazing. It just kind of folds into itself as near as anybody can tell. The biologists at North Slope Burrow, which is based in Utqiagvik, the wildlife biologists there have done just an enormous amount of work, and it's really difficult after you pulled a whale out of the water because everything kind of goes like that. But they have actually tried to figure out some of the mechanisms for that, and they do think it just kind of folds back onto itself. Let me get out of this. I do have a piece. I've got a couple of pieces of baleen. These are not long ones, but this is here we go. This is bowhead baleen. So there we go. So you can see it's very fine. The hairs on it are extremely fine. And compare that to gray whale baleen, which is really coarse. So it's much coarser. Of course, it's much shorter. Now this piece is only about, I don't know, 3 feet, maybe 3.5 feet. And again, bowhead baleen will get to be up to 13 feet. This piece actually I love. It's dusty, but this was actually scrimshawed on it, and it was scrimshawed by the daughter, Sadie Neacock, who was a very, very widely respected woman in Barrow. She was actually the first magistrate in Barrow. She's the daughter of Charlie Brower, who was a Yankee whaler who went up there around 1890 and stayed, married a Inupiat woman, had 12 children, and part of Barrow, or Utqiagvik, is actually called Browerville, after Charlie Brower and his huge family. So yeah, so there's the kind of a combination or comparison of the two different kinds of baleen.
Thank you.
Wonderful. If you have asked a question in the chat and you want to just ask it, go right ahead. I know Jeff Jacobson was asking about seeing the possibility of seeing any right whales up there. It didn't look like you did.
No, so right whales, the North Pacific right whale, of course, is probably one of the most endangered marine mammals anywhere. They think it could be I think they've identified actually 30. So it probably isn't too much larger than that, a stock. And they're pretty much in the Bering Sea. There's critical habitat for them in kind of, let's see, the eastern Bering Sea, I want to say. And they even acoustic data only has them maybe in the northern Bering Sea, but not even that close to the Bering Strait. So there was some whaling records. A man named Townsend he put together a lot of whaling records from the Bering and Chukchi Seas. And in those whaling records, he referred to a lot of right whales up in the Chukchi Sea. But the belief is now that what he was referring to were Greenland right whales, which are bowheads. So that even though the whaling records said right whales, they think probably he was talking about Greenland right whales, and knowing those are actually bowheads. So we, trust me, that was another one. You know, we told everybody that if they saw a right whale up in our study area, you dropped everything and just circle that baby until you got really, really good photographs. That never happened. So I also want to mention too, you know, the photos and stuff, we always worked under a permit, National Marine Fisheries Service permit. And for polar bears and walrus, we operated under a permit from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So even though some of those photos looked like they were very close up, we did not fly below 1,000 feet, even though our permit said we could, under circumstances, go to 500. We generally surveyed about 1,100 to 1,300 feet. And actually for polar bears and walrus, it was even higher than that to try to avoid any kind of potential impacts.
Well, wonderful. I was curious about the aggregation of the different species when you had the fin and the humpbacks and the grays. Was that, I know you said that they kind of hang out together. Was there also a bit of an aggregation of food source there? I think you mentioned it.
Yeah. Now, the thing is, like, humpbacks and fin whales are going to probably be feeding on different food than gray whales. Mm-hmm. But there is overlap as well, because we know that gray whales will also feed in the water column. They don't only feed on the bottom. So, It probably has more to do with oceanographic conditions, that where they are areas of upwelling, areas where because there's a rich area of upwelling, you have also fallout of detritus to the bottom, which is going to make the feeding for gray whales better. So it's kind of probably a whole combination of things. They are found in slightly different areas, but they do overlap a lot too. So it's just that southern Chukchi, south central Chukchi is a very rich oceanographic area.
Wow, very cool. Someone was asking about you needing to describe suction feeding for us. Who was that? Yeah.
So suction feeding can be a couple. So with gray whales, what they'll do is go along the bottom, and I can't remember which side. I want to say it's always on the right side, but I'm not sure. They'll go along the bottom and they're kind of sucking sediment up into their mouths. So that's kind of gray whale suction feeding. With narwhals, because they really don't have teeth, so they create, as near as people can tell, narwhals and beaked whales, other whales that don't have a lot of teeth, they will basically create a suction. They do have a suction mechanism, which is how they get the food in, because they don't have teeth to be able to grab it. I don't know if they know exactly how the suction mechanism works. Basically for all those species, they're not in captivity. So pretty much they just have to go with specimens that they can get and then try to recreate it. So and I really have topped out there on what I know of suction feeding.
I was wondering if they had muscles in their throat that expand the throat out to create the suction.
Well, they can't expand the throat too much because they don't really have a lot of room, for beaked whales. Gray whales could, because they do have, like 2 to 7 throat grooves. For the other ones, though, for like narwhals and beaked whales, they don't have that kind of room. For gray whales, I think that would be a possibility. I don't think it's ever been shown, mostly because we don't have any video of them actually feeding. I imagine if you actually tried to video gray whales, it would just be a murky mess because it's a lot of sediment at the bottom. I don't think you'd be able to see anything.
Exactly. I love those mystery questions, like how do gray whales nurse? How do they get their milk? It's just such an intimate sort of situation that there are so many mysteries that we get to
Still are, right?
explore. There is another question here from Tim, I think. How do the Alaskan natives create a sustainable ecosystem with the bowhead?
As far as referring to the hunt, perhaps, or I assume it might be for the hunt. The Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission has been around. I think it was formed either in the late 70s or early 80s, and that is an organization that works together with NOAA, and they basically regulate how many whales can be taken each year. The U.S. is also a member of the International Whaling Commission, and so that actually makes the U.S. a whaling nation, which a lot of people don't realize. They get their quota from the International Whaling Commission, and they have worked over the years to support, for example, the census to figure out how many bowheads there actually are. When this project actually first got started, and when a lot of the research first got started, it was believed that there might be as few as 2,000 bowhead whales. And the Native Alaskans who had hunted these whales for years said, no, that cannot be true. We do not believe that at all. And that's part of what came about. That's part of why the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission was formed. And so what they have done is they assist with the census, which occurs every 3 to 5 to 10 years. It's getting much harder to do because the ice is breaking up, and that's where they used to do it, to basically figure out how many whales actually are there. They've hired some of the brightest people in the world who are much smarter than me, statisticians. They did visual surveys, both from the ice as well as overhead. They did photographic ID to figure out mark recapture. They did acoustic studies where they realized that what they're seeing in the lead in spring of whales going by, they realized that the whales are also, they can travel under ice. They can actually, a bowhead whale can poke through at least 18 inches, and it might be even more than that, I can't remember now, of ice.
Yeah.
So if they're traveling, you can look at an area and go, well, it's 100% ice. There's nothing out there. But a bowhead whale can go through there, surface, push through that ice with basically with the top of its head, take a breath, take a few breaths, and then go back down again. So we survey an area and go, oh my God, it's 100% ice, nothing there. Like 18 inches of ice probably to a bowhead are no different than open water. So that's pretty much how AEWC, North Slope Borough, NOAA, how they work together to regulate the hunt. And to the point where if hunters hunt outside of the season, if they take a whale after the quota has been reached for a village, that whaler will be punished basically by his own community. This was several years ago, and I don't even remember what village. A whaler did exactly that, and he deliberately went out. The village had already met its quota. He went out and took a whale anyway because he wanted to. He was a whaling captain, and he felt that was his right. And the community, his whaling community, basically, they said, no, that was not right. And you're going to have to serve 2 months of detention where you're not going to be allowed to leave your home. Okay, big deal. Well, they made that 2 months be during the next whaling season. He's the captain. His crew doesn't go out without him. So that was a big sign to say, don't do that. We're serious about this, because if we go over that quota, that's where people are going to come back and go, look, you're not doing, this is just window dressing. It's not window dressing. They work very hard to get a sustainable hunt.
Right. Wow. That's pretty cool. Let's see, Scott was curious about Scott Mercer, who is perched on the edge of the continent most days with his wife. Is wondering, he's saying that the gray whale calves are weaning midsummer. Is that what
it depends? It depends on when, a lot of it will depend on when they're born. They can wean anywhere from 7 to 9 months.
Mm-hmm.
We certainly see several calves that are still very closely associated with their moms. So we assume that they haven't weaned, or they haven't been completely weaned. We see a lot of calves hanging at the surface and without mud plumes. And so that tells us that they're not feeding, at least at the bottom yet. And we see that we'll see gray whale calves well into October. So they haven't all weaned by midsummer. There's still calves that are hanging out in very close association with the females as late as October.
As late as, and then at that point, then you'll start to see them with their plumes and see that they're starting to.
Well, at that point, darkness descends. So
that's right. Let's see. There's so many great questions here. Let me see if I can grab some more. Everybody is just thrilled. Great talk, and thank you so much. Fantastic. Thank you. Let's see. Just curious. Tim is wondering, just curious about how well the Ruskies and other nations treat and track whales, especially in international waters.
My experience has been that that if you're working directly with Russian scientists, it's, despite language problems, etc., it's relatively easy. The difficulty is the difficulty is that you have to deal with the politics, and that's what becomes a lot more difficult. There have actually been the North Slope Borough, which is the kind of the county government in northern Alaska. They actually funded several studies for the Russians, especially on bowheads in Chukotka. And so there's been some published reports out of that. There have been some joint studies. Rusalka, which was the Russian-US something, were cruises that went on, and for 2 years at least, they did cruises over they went across the date line and were able to get phenomenal data. And then again, things kind of ebb and flow, and politics gets involved, and all of a sudden the ship is not allowed to go into port anymore. So it is difficult. There are some very dedicated Russian scientists who are working in the Russian Arctic on usually not as broad scale projects as we can do here. They're usually maybe smaller. There is actually another project on, there's been joint studies on polar bears. There's been joint studies on ice seals, which are a big concern. Nobody really has an idea for how many different ice seals. I mean, we know the species, but how many there are. And there's been some joint projects on those between the Russians and the Americans. So it is possible. And again, the few interactions I've had with Russian biologists have been really fruitful. There's been a lot of exchange of information. And so it really depends on how much you can get done without getting the larger governments involved.
Right. Sure.
So yeah.
Interests. Great. Well, I know that it is 7:10 and I want to give you an opportunity to take a sip of water since you've been talking nonstop for about over an hour here.
I'm out of water.
And then, what did you say?
I'm out of water.
Oh, you're out of water. Do you need to go get some? Well,
Okay.
you're okay. There is, let's see, I see hands raised, and then does the unusual mortality event only affect gray whales? Anything unique about them? The toxicology event on the West Coast?
No. There's actually there was, I don't know if it's still active to tell you the truth, Guadalupe fur seals. There are also unusual mortality events we've been seeing a lot in seabirds. So it happened a few years ago, I want to say 2014, 15, something like that, with ringed seals. So they, different species, it has cropped up in different species.
Yeah, unusual mortality event can be pretty much anything, but
Right.
yeah, Guadalupe fur seals and gray whales. And we got the Fukushima question. Can the Fukushima radiation event still play a role? Yeah, we'll probably move past that question. Well, unless you want to,
I have no idea.
Okay, good.
No idea.
It comes up at most talks, and
Okay.
I'm not putting it down at all. It was a big deal, and we just
definitely
anniversary, and I think people are still curious as to how something massive could, how it affects stuff all over the planet. Gil, do you want to ask a question? I see your hand is up. Maybe I pronounced your name wrong. G-U-I-L, Gil, Nope. To just unmute yourself if you want to ask a question.
We once observed a group of gray whales, a bubble ring feeding up north of Westport. And I'm wondering if that's unusual behavior or if you've seen that before.
We haven't seen anything like bubble nets like humpbacks do, where they swim underneath and then swirl up and kind of trap carrying. Haven't seen anything like that. We do see what we call underwater blows. So it's kind of an exhalation of air that's underwater, and it kind of creates this sort of bubble thing from gray whales. But I don't know that it had anything to do with feeding, from what we've seen. Again, because of where, I think it would really depend on what they're feeding on. If they're feeding in the benthos on the bottom, there would be no reason to do any kind of a bubble net. But if they're water column feeding, then it could, definitely could be something. But we haven't, we have seen humpbacks bubble net feeding in the southern Chukchi, but we haven't seen any gray whales doing that.
Interesting. And they're kind of doing all sorts of different kind of feeding. I mean, we now have some that we see, the year-round feeding group pretty much off Point Arena, Sea Ranch, Mendocino, certain individuals that are just here, we can almost count on them.
Yeah.
And when I was in the school, it was like, no, their gray whales are not here in the summertime, and that's definitely changed. I think one last question. I see that Sue Coulter has her hand raised, and then we will let you go.
You might not be able to answer this, Janet, but recently a few of us, because we've been brushing up on gray whale facts, is there any scientific exploration around the fact that they're the lone one with lice, and could it have something to do with the fact that they're bottom feeders? Again, don't know if there's anybody that's ever, checked that out. 2 or 3 of us in the last week have been talking about it and going like, I wonder if that's why.
That's a good question, and I do not know. I really, truly don't.
Couldn't help but ask.
Yeah. That's a good question. Now,
Yeah.
I think that right whales also have lice
Okay, well, there you go.
in the callosities. And my
Okay.
guess would be is that they are unique lice to them, just as gray whale lice is unique to gray whales.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. That would be
I know,
for,
right? I just had that curiosity. I was like,
yeah, I don't know.
Thank you. It's been such a fabulous talk, and thank you everybody who's been to listening to it. And like Sarah said earlier, don't hesitate to donate a little to the cause.
Yeah, I mean, we just are so lucky. And, you know, the real silver lining of COVID is that we've gotten used to Zooming. We've gotten used to muting ourselves. We've gotten actually kind of good at this. And in many ways, I hope that we continue to be able to bring science to people that, you know, aren't traveling great distances to go and hear a talk, and bring scientists to our venue and enlighten us with stories from afar, and in this case, the Pacific Arctic. How wonderful.
Yeah.
I think we can let you go, but I can't thank you enough. Do you have any last comments? And I'm sure people will want to, I know you mentioned websites, but perhaps you could send that slide to Wendy so she can have that to share.
I can do that. And also I'll send my email. So if you have questions or, you know, want something that didn't get answered or something like that, I'm happy to, you know, answer it or direct you on to somebody who can, because there are a lot of people out there who can help with that as well. So I'll make sure to send that to Wendy. So thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun. I usually give talks to like other, you know, bowhead people or you know, something like that. It's a lot of graphs and a lot of, you know, and this ratio was that this was fun.
Thank you very much. Very well done.
Yes. Thank you, Janet.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Come visit
you.
us.
Yeah.
I will as soon as
Yeah.
possible. Thank you.
Great. Take good care. Thank you again.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.